Now we're going to start going into the process and kick it off with some requirements gathering. As we do this, I'd like you to do this by yourself. I'd like you to work through these activities as we go through it. So you're getting to apply this to hopefully a real world scenario that you have to build a dashboard for yourself. And to do that, it's going to be important to identify who's involved. Who are the cast of characters? Who are going to be the users, the stakeholders? You may not have insight into that right now, but it's going to be very important to get insight into that. So if you don't know, the very, very, very first step is understand who's involved, the cast of characters. You can just write them down on a piece of paper. Just say, here's who's involved. And then just see if there's any gaps, any potential issues. Like a typical issue you're going to have here is, okay, if you have an IT department involved and you've got a business stakeholder involved, potentially there's some friction there. There mightn't be, but there may be. There may be some bad blood. So how can that be navigated? So it's just flag these things early on so it can help you strategize on how you want to proceed. So the first thing we're going to do, this is the next step in this process, is to do the stakeholder interviews. And this is to capture the objectives and goals of the dashboard. Now, it's fairly structured. And the way I like to do this is invite people, might be one or two people, to a fairly casual meeting. And by casual, I mean, maybe it's coffee, maybe it's lunch. It's not overly formal. If you can do formal, that's fine. If you have to do it, that's fine. I like to keep it fairly informal. You get people more with their guard down, and you'll ultimately get better results from it. If it's, if you're recording things, if you got a recorder on the table, people are going to be very sensitive to that. And I don't advise doing that. I used to do it myself, and I found ultimately I got better results by keeping things informal. So why would you do it? Well, it's obvious. You want to capture the objectives and business goals. What do they want to achieve? What's the point in doing this? Obviously, they have an idea behind it, right? And why is it important? And what is the value if properly implemented? Now, you might recall that example I was given of Jane where, she might have got an email and she's been asked to build something, but she doesn't have the full context. Well, this is where she'd start. Who can she talk to? Does she even know who to talk to? So that's step one. Find out who you need to talk to. And you can use this template. At least make sure you're going to ask these questions. And just bring a notepad. You can have these questions written down on a notepad and make a bit of space that you can write the answer directly underneath. But these are the minimum questions that need to be asked. So I'm just going to quickly walk through these. And it does happen where maybe you can't get to talk to the stakeholder and you might just have to do this by yourself. And if that's the case, and certainly it may be the case for you doing this course and you want to just do these activities right now on the spot, then I suggest you get out your pen and you can pause this right here and start going through these questions as I step through them and write down the answers you think the stakeholder would have. So the very first one, what is the motivation for wanting this dashboard? Keep the answer short. So let's take an example of that business performance dashboard. That is, the motivation is we want a single source of truth so we can start to optimize our margins, let's say. Next question, what is the business value and outcomes you want to see in this effort? Well, the outcome, we wanted greater visibility and transparency across all our departments. We wanted the low performers in the department to be able to start seeing what things the high performers were doing so they could replicate it for their business units. Okay, that's very interesting. Probably wouldn't have come up with that myself. What are your current challenges in relation to reporting? And you can see the persona captures a lot of this because the persona gets fed by these interview questions. You saw in that case study, a lot of this kind of stuff got surfaced. This is where you surface it. So what are your current challenges in relation to reporting? Well, we've got so many different sources. We don't agree on KPIs, on metrics, on the calculations. Okay, so this is where you get that. This part might be quite long, so make sure you have the space to do that. Has anything prevented this project from happening in the past? And that's important because there may have been initiatives before and they may have failed for certain reasons. And how do we know we're not going to fail again? How do we know that's not going to continue to happen? So by understanding what happened in the past, maybe we can navigate around prevention and come up with a better solution this time around. What metrics do you currently look at? So as we discussed, we certainly want to have those included in our dashboard and the metrics that they currently look at. And what metrics would you like to see? And take this with a pinch of salt. It sure would be nice to see lots and lots of things, but quite often they're somewhat idealistic. So when I'm asking this question, I tend to frame it by saying the approach we're taking with building this dashboard is a long-term approach. We're going to be doing a lot of versions, a lot of iterations of it. So we're not going to get everything in version 1. We're not going to get everything in version 4. But we want to cast the net out there and understand what would be valuable. So when you frame it in that context, you're not saying no to anyone, and you're kind of setting the tone for, yeah, look, if it's not in version 1, don't worry about it. We can still deal with it in subsequent versions. And finally, what are the top questions you want answered from the data? Now, this is a bit open-ended, and certainly you'd want more than 15 minutes if you're going to get quite a bit of input from this. My preference is not to go beyond half an hour, but on occasion I do go to an hour. Just depends how many stakeholders I'm interviewing. So not the end of the world if you go to an hour, but it's very valuable to get questions here at this point. Now, as we go through this, there is another option for doing these kinds of interviews, and I'm going to cover that a little bit later on, and that's using a workshop. If you are comfortable and if you are able to facilitate a workshop for a couple of hours where you can bring in a few stakeholders and a few users and work through the personas and these questions there in the workshop, it's really valuable and it's really fast. So if you haven't already done so, just pause the video here and fill out these questions yourself. You can also follow these steps here once you feel like you're more comfortable. You don't need to follow this anymore. It's pretty straightforward following the directions. So we'll move on to the user interviews. So there are user challenges, motivations, needs. This is going to form the crux of who we're designing for. And those who we're designing for, they need to be aligned with the stakeholders that we just interviewed. So again, set of structured interviews. Tend to make this a little bit more formal. Might be a sit down for an hour. Tend not to record again. And the reason I make this more formal and the other one more informal is sometimes folks won't be comfortable inviting an executive or a stakeholder to a formal meeting. It might seem like a bit much, and that they have to be very, very careful in how they do the interview. Whereas someone who's asking a more senior person for a coffee to pick their brain a bit, it's much less stress. There's much less expectation on them. So that's why I advocate for that. For the user interviews, it's okay to be a little bit more formal, to have a bit more structure. I still tend not to record it, but I think it's up to you at this point. So why you would do it? Well, we want to understand their current challenges, what goals they have, any current processes that they use, and is there an opportunity to improve things? And then certainly it's a chance for us to align the user base, or at least those people that we're interviewing, with what the expectations are for the dashboard. And so it kind of sets the tone to say, yeah, we kind of have to keep inside these swimming lanes here because this is the outcomes that we're looking for. And similar to the stakeholder interviews, here is a template for doing user interviews. And they're broadly similar, but the questions are more focused on what things are like for them. It's a bit more tactical. So the first one, what does your typical week look like? And what I'm aiming for here is, what do they do? What's important in relation to this dashboard, in relation to the data? How can this help them? So what are they get up Monday morning, what do they do? What's on their mind? How could the dashboard help them? How do you currently access and use data? So maybe they have a report, maybe they don't have anything. And these are all really important things, because if we don't know what they're doing, let's say they currently use a dashboard, what if it's a really good dashboard already? And there's just something wrong with it, and all it needs is some tweaking. Well and good. So if we don't ask those questions, then we don't know, and we're going to be wasting time. What are your current challenges in relation to reporting? What goals do you have in your role, and how can data help? Those goals should obviously be aligned to the business, because hopefully the business has defined the goals for this role. What metrics do you currently look at? So this is the same as the stakeholder. What metrics would you like to see? And this is where we want to check, is that aligned to the stakeholder objectives? And what are the top questions you want answered from the data? So similar again, but we want to spend more time on the questions here. That's why we'd extend this out to an hour. We want to capture a pretty extensive list of questions that they would like to have answered. And you can follow these steps here on how to do it. And again, you give yourself an hour, and don't be overly formal, but keep some structure to it. Have a plan, introduce yourself, this is what's going on, this is what the stakeholders have said, we need to be doing, these are objectives. So it's all framed up nicely, and then you can proceed with the interview. So you can pause the video right here and complete those questions by yourself. Imagine you're the user. What questions would they be answering? And just hit play once you're ready to continue. We're going to jump into personas. So we want to be able to condense the outputs of both the stakeholder interviews and the user interviews, and we want to bundle them up by role. So it may happen you have lots of personas. It may happen you have one persona. On average, I tend to find there is going to be one stakeholder persona and one or two user personas. So what is it? A persona is a representation of a type of person, and a persona answers the question, who are we designing for? And they help to align strategy and goals to specific user groups. So that's the coming together of the stakeholders and the users. And we do it because it is an efficient way to capture group common objectives, goals, characteristics, and challenges of the people involved in the dashboard. And the example that we saw earlier, we've got a variation of that type of persona where you can see, okay, here's one's filled out. This persona is called Mary Doyle. An example of a quote: my assistant is gone for a month, so creating my reports is a major issue. We don't have self-service. Well, that was very interesting for a lot of people to find out, well, Mary can't even find what's going on in the business because her person who does that is out. And because it's such a technical task, no one else can do it. So that's a vital piece of information that can help us focus more on self-service for maybe the first round of the dashboard. So this is what we're trying to achieve here. And when I do this in a workshop, and we look at this in more detail, what a workshop looks like. But when I do it in a workshop, you can condense here the user and stakeholder interviews and just go straight to building personas if you have the right people in the room. That's sort of what that would look like. That's 3 different personas. Now, the template you can use here, you can just draw this on a piece of paper. And you can have you obviously give the persona a title. So it might be, let's say, HR manager, sales manager, whatever it is. And you would feed in the information from the interviews here. Now, in this case, we've got two templates. We've got one for the stakeholder persona, and we've got one for the user persona. So the stakeholder persona is slightly different to the user one. In this case, okay, we've got the professional background, objectives, and business outcomes. So this is the higher level view, right? We've got this very, very high level view, challenges and pain points, and then questions that need to be answered. So, this is going to be more of a strategic type of persona. So you take the time to fill this out. My preference in how I do this is I use a whiteboard. But you can equally just do it on a piece of paper. The reason I use a whiteboard is because I like to use sticky notes. So I'd have lots of sticky notes. And as I'm going through this, I would use one sticky note per objective, one sticky note per challenge. So I might have 20 sticky notes for challenges, and then I'd use a sticky note per question to be answered. And so you get all these, and the reason you do that is so you can move them around. You can be flexible. If you have multiple personas with similar questions, you can just move things around, and you can. It's a nice way to group things. As you'll see, we'll need to be grouping questions and moving things around. So that's why my preference is for sticky notes. You could just do it on a piece of paper and write directly down on the paper. Now, very similar is the user persona template. And you can see the only real differences here is we've got challenges, goals, but we still have questions to be answered. So if you haven't done so already, you can pause the video here and complete those personas, both stakeholder and user. For the purpose of the exercise, just do one user persona and just do one stakeholder persona. Moving on to questions. So the next step in the process, and this is where we're keeping things in a natural language. It's still human understandable. We're not getting overly burdened with technical detail here. So these are the questions that the personas want to be able to answer with the dashboard. Now we've already obviously touched on that with the interviews and creating the personas, where we started to map those out. But we want to make sure we're getting them all. So there may still be gaps. So it's a way to map out business needs, data, and action through identifying what questions have value. And we do it because it creates a bridge of understanding between non-technical and technical stakeholders to achieve business value through the dashboard. The activity here is to continue on with those personas that you have and start to identify any gaps. There may be questions that the stakeholder had that are not being answered, are not in the list of questions that the user persona has. So we need to identify those gaps and make sure they're addressed. So that could end up in adding questions. That's usually what happens, is you end up just adding some more questions. Also, you want to take the opportunity to break down larger questions into smaller questions. So if a question seems overly large, like how do I reduce attrition? Well, that's kind of big. You might want to break that down into what are the top 3 causes of attrition? What is the cost of attrition, right? So you want to take really large questions and break them down into smaller questions. And again, you're maintaining one sticky note per question. So you can pause the video here to do that. And we're going to then continue on with scenario mapping. This is one of the most important steps in this process. It's a quick way to collaboratively create, discuss, and communicate user scenarios. It really makes you think about what people need to see. And this is sort of the first step in the visualization process of what the wireframe is going to look like. So you end up listing the tasks that a user needs to perform on the dashboard. And it helps to think about the users and what are the most important things they need to do. So that's sort of the prioritization we're going to have. We're going to be thinking, first and foremost, what's the most important activities they're going to be doing on the dashboard? And how do we reduce the number of clicks they have to do in order to fulfill those tasks? So you would follow these steps in order to do that. So you start with the persona and identify the most important question that they need to be answering. Now, it should already be in a sticky note. If it's not, I strongly recommend you start using sticky notes here for this part. Now, what must they be able to see in order to answer it? So put your question on the sticky note and stick that on the table or whiteboard. And beside that, you're going to put another sticky note. On that sticky note, you will describe what they need to see to answer that question. And then to the right of that, is there a KPI that will help support answering that question? Or is there like a leading indicator that will help if there's a problem with answering that question? So remember, going back to the dashboard layout, where we want to have a KPI that's orange and it's leading down to a chart to help us understand what's going on. So is there something orange in a KPI that would lead the user to look at that dashboard? So if there is, great, write it down, put it to the right. If there's not, no worries. The next sticky note we're going to write on is, what's the action? Is there an associated action? Hopefully there is, not the end of the world if there isn't. And there may be multiple actions. And you're going to stick these to the right of the KPIs or to the right of what they need to see, depending on if you have a KPI or not. So you're going to end up with a bunch of sticky notes with a bunch of questions and a bunch of sticky notes related to each question. So hopefully you'll have a load of rows. Each row starts with a question. Now let's look at an example of how that might look. So the question, are we short on any inventory in any of our stores? That's the question. Okay, well, what does the user need to see to answer that? Show me a comparison of what current store inventory is versus what we plan to see in the next 4 weeks. Would like to see it per store, per product, so can spot any problem fast. Okay, that's cool. I think everyone can understand that it's in plain natural language terms. And we're not describing what the chart looks like yet. But this helps. This is an interim step to picking what the chart might look like. Is there a KPI? This might be reflected in a sales forecast figure, but it wouldn't have its own KPI. Okay, interesting to know. So we're thinking there's going to be some sort of KPI up there that's going to be impacted by this. Our KPI up there that we may be able to get better understanding about what's going on with that KPI if it's orange by looking at this chart. Is there an action to be taken? Looks like we've 2 stickies here. Call the store and ask if inventory is accurate. If it is not, ask them to update their system. The other one, call procurement and inform them that one of the stores needs to be restocked for product X. Okay, so we have now a series of these rows, and you can pause the video here and start taking your questions and apply this process to them. And this is highly valuable. This is one of the steps I tend not to skip just because it's really important. And I love to do this with a group of people in a workshop, but often you can't. So use the sticky notes, map this out, and then when you're finished, just bundle each of these under its own question, so you have them grouped, because we're going to start moving on to creating the tabs under grouping questions. So we're going to group these questions into similar topics, themes, and already by persona. So we're going to group them. Why we do that? It's a move towards creating tabs in the dashboard. Now, at this point, it'll be determined if separate dashboards are needed per persona, or perhaps different tabs in the same dashboard, or if they can all be blended together. So it helps you to make several decisions in how you're going to organize your dashboard. So you can see, well, okay, are we being overly broad? Do we have too many questions? Does it look like there's going to be like 50 tabs? Do we need to just separate this out more by personas? It helps you get a better assessment of, have you been good in your design up to date? So how you go about doing this. So you take the completed questions that you had from earlier, and they should still be separated by persona. I tend to like to just take a persona slice first and go through the whole process, then move on to the next persona, go through the process. So start by making logical groupings. So if it's, let's say we take the HR example, the groupings might be attrition, diversity, training, retention, though it should be kind of clear by the type of question that's being asked. So you would start grouping them that way. And it is highly likely that questions would need to be repeated across groupings. So make duplicates of the questions as needed. So let's say in the HR example, you have all of these tabs, but on all of those tabs, it's just important to know what's the overall headcount of the company. So that's a KPI you might just want to have across all of them. So in which case you would want to replicate the question, what is our headcount across all of these groupings? So you may end up creating additional sticky notes here at this point. Now you do another check to see if the questions are sufficiently granular to have value, and it may be necessary to break questions up into more constituent parts again. So just be sure to check on that, because if it's overly vague, it's going to be pretty hard to be able to answer it, and also then to have an action that backs it up. to allow for some sort of resolution. And during the whole process, keep in mind there's a relationship between KPIs at the top of the dashboard and the more detailed information that will be in the charts in the main part of the dashboard. We need to be able to maintain that narrative. Now, we will have gone a lot of the way there by doing the scenario mapping earlier on. And finish this step by just grouping up your questions so they're nice and discrete bundles. You may not need to do the next step, but if you're not familiar with the data, it's going to be really handy to get some sense on understanding what questions can be answered with the available data. It also allows you to start coming up with a versioning. So you can say, well, yeah, some of these questions we can't answer, but look like the data is getting better. So version 2, we're going to put these ones in. So we have to have high confidence for the end users. They have to really trust that these dashboards are good. So the data must be available of good quality and have sufficient velocity. And the velocity here is if you're acting on something in a dashboard. So let's say you update the inventory. You take that action to update the inventory in that last example. And you open the dashboard a week later and there's been no change. But you know the inventory has been updated, but it's not been reflected in the dashboard. So people are going to start getting a bit annoyed by that. So they'll go, yeah, this isn't really that good. I'm not having the impact that I wanted to have, or I'm not getting the feedback I wanted. So this is where you would check in on that is, okay, what kind of speed velocity can we have here? Can we get daily updates? If not, we can design for it. We can design around it. But it's important to be aware of it because we want this feedback loop. You want to be able to see, okay, I've taken action and I can see the impact a day later. That's the beauty of it is then you start building high trust with the user base. They can see this more as a tool, not something to look at. It's a tool for them to act. And of course, any question that doesn't satisfy these criteria, then you can say, well, maybe the data quality is not great, so let's not include it. Okay, how you do that, if you have been doing this by yourself up until date and you don't know the data, you don't know the state of the data, I would invite for lunch or maybe a longer meeting, a longer sit-down meeting with someone who has intimate knowledge of the data, and you can take them through the questions you have on your sticky notes. So they'll get a really good flavor of what's going on. You can also show them the personas that you have. So there'll be context there. And that's a very nice thing to do with folks who are the owners of the data, because often they don't know and they don't have context. So it's a nice way to build that relationship with them as well. So you can sit down with them and go through the questions and just ask, look, can we provide the data in the way that it needs to be seen by these users? Now, the technology check, usually one you can skip over, but it depends on the capabilities of the tools that you have. But it's basically, can you implement the design of the dashboard the way you see it in the technology that's available? And you would do that because obviously, if there's certain chart types you can't build, then you won't use those in the wireframe. So how you go about doing that? I think this is, you could take a similar approach to with the data check. You could, invite someone who doesn't know the tool. Though my preference here is to get the tool itself and start going through it and start to understand the capabilities if you don't know already. And you can start comparing the chart cards, KPI cards with the tool, and you can see which ones are possible, which ones are not possible. And it's usually going to be the chart cards. There might be some chart types you can't do in the technology. So then you just take those out of the deck and don't include them when you're doing the wireframing. On to KPI selection, and this is going to be building on what we did back in the scenario mapping. We're going to be picking the KPIs, the key performance indicators. Now, if you remember earlier on, we had the step in the scenario mapping where we were picking out, okay, is there a KPI related to what this persona needs to see in order to answer this question? So we're going to be determining what's at the top of the dashboard with this. And we're going to be taking a view of these have to be a really quick reference. It's like, these are things that you open the dashboard, it's orange, I need to do something, the answer is further down on the tab. So I have to have that approach. And how you do it. So you take each of the groups that you had earlier identified, which is a tab, And you're going to start laying these out. You're going to look about, okay, which ones did we identify as KPIs? Okay, let's lay those out. And then we're going to start taking the KPI deck from the dashboard wireframe kit. You're going to take those and you're going to start populating them. You're going to start writing them in. And anything that's not there in scenario mapping, you might find there's a few more KPIs you might have to add anyway. So this is that opportunity where you're going to figure out everything that needs to be in a KPI. Is there a associated chart that you might want to have there? And yes, there should be, because in the scenario mapping process, you would have already identified that. And then you don't have to have all of the 4 KPI slots filled. You might have 2 of them, you might have 3 of them, you might have 5. They're all okay. If you've got 1, okay, you don't have to try and fill up the other 3, but you could see, well, what other opportunities do I have to have a KPI here? So it might spur your thinking and creativity a little bit to come up with more. So place all the completed KPI cards on the dashboard template. But be sure that you've finished the reverse side. So not just the presentation there, but also the meta information there. The information on the back that's saying this is when it changes color. Now you don't quite have the information yet to be able to say which chart it's going to reference, because you're going to fill that in a little bit later once you finish the chart selection. So speaking of chart selection, if you haven't paused the video already, you can pause it now and you can go through the KPIs. And we'll step into the chart selection, which is obviously the primary 4 charts we're going to have on the dashboard. You don't have to populate all 4, but these are going to be using the chart cards to help you answer the questions that you have and then the path to action. And the user should not have to think too much about this. If you can, get Steve Krug's book on Don't Make Me Think. It's about web design, but it's, the whole concept of someone has, 7 seconds of attention when they go onto a website. They don't want to think about what the site is about. And that's going to be the same thing with the dashboard. We don't want to force people to have to figure things out. It should just be intuitive. It should just be obvious. So we continue on with those groupings we have of the questions. Now, we know what we did with the KPIs, so we can build on that. We can start taking the sticky notes we got from the scenario mapping in our groups and start to take the what they need to see, take each of those sticky notes and get the chart cards. And we're going to start populating the chart cards. Now, based on the question and what they need to see, you can start to determine what type of chart they should have. So you'll recall each chart has the usage section at the bottom. So in the example we had earlier, I want to be able to compare inventory versus sales, or some number, some comparison. So I look at the chart cards and I see, oh, there's comparison. There's a line chart. Okay, that's a comparison. Does that make sense? To answer this, is that aligned with what that person needs to see? Okay, yes, great. Okay, that's the chart I'm going to use. Now you might find that you're going to have 2 or 3 charts that look like they're good for comparison. So pick the one that's going to be most intuitive. Look at the question. Okay, does that clearly indicate, in the least amount of effort and conscious engagement required, does that tell me what's going on? Does that answer my question? So once you finish that, you can quickly revisit the KPIs just to see, okay, which KPI is this chart tied to? And then you would, on the meta information side of the KPI chart, you would just fill in, oh, this is related to the chart on position C2. So you're building that connection between the KPI and the chart card. Now, again, on the meta information side of these cards, you want to put in the question that's being answered and then the resultant action. And you have the resultant action already from the scenario mapping step. So this is really a case of putting in the information you already have there from the scenario mapping, but also adding in the context of what this chart's going to look like. So you're doing that by picking the actual chart card itself. So take a bit of time to do that. So you can pause the video here, and then we're going to continue on to the filter selection. So how do we want the data on this dashboard to be filtered? So it's it's an art and a science, this one. It's a challenge. And the way I like to think of doing filters is you could easily end up with a ton of filters on a tab of a dashboard. And I've seen cases where there's up to 10. And the desire is, well, for anything there is a dimension for in the data, let's have a filter for it. And that's like the analogy of, well, because there's data, let's put it on the dashboard, right? So yeah, it kind of makes sense, but it's not great for the user. It's not a great user experience. So if you're finding that you have a lot of filters, or you want to have a lot of filters, it's a good time to revisit the persona perspective. So is that how a persona would want to filter their data? And if you're really adamant, oh God, there has to be the 10 filters here. Okay, then that is an argument for either having more tabs, or you are not being granular enough with your personas, and you have to go back to the persona stage. Now there is another case here where you have maybe the argument for creating more charts. Can that filter be converted into a chart? Let's say you could start moving these filters over to charts. The criteria I use for this is every chart you have in your dashboard, on your wireframe, if you want to add a filter, does that filter make sense for every single chart? Keeping in mind that every chart should be updated by a filter. There shouldn't be special cases. So if you click on one of those filters, does every chart and KPI get filtered by that filter, and does it make sense? And if not, then it's an argument for chucking it out, or at a minimum it's an argument for putting it on another tab or creating another tab based around that. So how you go about that is you start to look for the obvious ones. So there's a hierarchy you might want to look at. Okay, so yeah, maybe there's a time filter. That's usually important. Is there a department filter, country filter, product filter, customer segment, all of the usual things? But these have to be informed by the persona. There's little advantage in taking a kind of just general approach here. We've been very persona focused so far on creating the charts and KPIs. We should maintain that for the filters as well. And certainly the users will have a good sense of that, and especially understanding the reports they have looked at in the past. So you can take a little bit of time to do that now, and you should start ending up with something that looks like this. Once you've put it all together, you've built your KPIs, your filters, and your charts, and you've put them all together, and you have two sides. You have your presentation side, which is the visual layer, and you take a photograph of that. And then you've got your meta information side, and you take a photo of that. And it should look something like this. You're going to have lots of these because you're going to have lots of tabs, typically. And also, if you have a lot of personas, you're going to have lots and lots of these. So it's important to capture these and take photos of them. And this is then what you're going to share out to people. Now, I did say that I like to do this whole process in a workshop. And this is what that looks like when I put it into a workshop format. Now, I've printed out printed templates here. These are panels. They're probably 3 foot by 4 foot, thereabouts. And it's basically a condensing of everything we've just gone through in this process. So there's two personas being represented here. There's the stakeholder persona, which is on the far left, and you can see the heavy use of sticky notes here. And then you can see there's a user perspective, user persona. You also see you can draw a likeness in here. So when I do a workshop like this, it might be 2 hours to 4 hours, and I have some stakeholders and users in the room, and we're going to go do this. We're going to take a run at it. I like people to start drawing a likeness, because it's a nice activity, it's a fun activity. It disarms people a little bit. It gets them out of the usual hustle and bustle of the workday, where people can be a little bit stressed. So getting them to draw something, it's a little bit of fun. It's a fun activity to sort of disarm people a little bit. And you can see then, it's the whole process here. You got the persona, you've got their objectives, their outcomes, bit of the professional background, and we got the challenges and pain points. And then the same thing with the users. Now you can see that there's a difference here between there's no questions under the stakeholder persona, but there are questions under the user persona. The reason I've done this is because since we have everyone in the room together, we're just going to focus on the questions for the user persona because the stakeholders are there. They're going to be able to give their input. So we're already getting the alignment between the users and the stakeholders right here on the spot. Now, you might not have the templates. Just draw this out on a whiteboard. That's what I usually do. I usually don't go to Staples and print these out. And you can certainly make your own, but most of the time I just draw this out. And the main ingredient here is sticky notes. And so I'll go through that whole process that we've just gone through. And we'll end up with a bunch of sticky notes that are the scenario mapping stage. So we'll do that together in the workshop. And also in the workshop, we have the option then to wireframe. To use the wireframe kit with everyone there, still there, and we'll put it into the wireframe. However, depending on people's availability and their time, I may just say, okay, folks, I'm going to put all this into wireframe and I'll send it out to you later. So it's about 50-50. Depends on time for folks, but this is a great way to accelerate the whole exchange. There is a caveat though. I advise you be comfortable with facilitating these engagements because you can be asking for trouble. So one of the cons with doing this is, yeah, it's very, very fast, but it can be highly political. It can be difficult, challenging. If you don't have the right people in the room, you may get a lopsided perspective of things. So that's the nice upside of doing it just by yourself and engaging people one at a time is you can understand the landscape of people that have to be involved and you can get all their input that way. Because in a workshop, some people won't speak up and other people will be overly vocal. And so you'll get a lopsided view of what the dashboard needs to be. So just take that with a pinch of salt. It's a balance. So I hope you enjoyed this training and that you got value from it and that you can start using this process yourself right away on your own dashboards. And there's really only one thing left to say, and that is thank you. Thank you for your time and your attention. And I look forward to lots of cool dashboards going out into the world.